Fred Fleitz, thank you for that. I'm indeed honored to be honored by you and Frank Gaffney. You have done tremendous work through many decades in defense of freedom and supporting our country. And it brings actually a lot of memories, because I first met you, and you mentioned Bill Casey. And for those of you that may not recall, William J. Casey was Ronald Reagan's CIA director, and I grew up a couple of miles from his home near Roslyn Harbor, New York, and I got to know in my youth the Casey family. And when I started in journalism, Bill Casey had passed away, but his widow, Sophia Casey, became a very strong supporter of my work. And it was in those years in the early 90s when I was covering the Clinton White House, which was a lonely journey for a reporter that was critical of the Clinton White House. The Caseys were big supporters, and they still are, of the center, and they asked me to come to Washington for a luncheon they were having in honor of Frank Gaffney, and I came down, and I was there at the luncheon at the Four Seasons Hotel. Not long in the luncheon, I meet this young fellow who introduces himself from the Central Intelligence Agency, and I tell him that I am a big fan of Bill Casey, and he says, "I'm a Casey guy." That man was Fred Fleitz. And we instantly became friends, close friends through the years. Our careers and professional activities have intersected many, many times, and he has done tremendous work in support of our president, who's been under siege, and you've seen Fred on so many programs. So I'm very happy that you're now helping Frank Gaffney and continue the good work of the Center for Security Policy, and I'm honored you have me here tonight. The work that Newsmax has done is always, I believe, to be in support of freedom, and I believe our security is integral to that freedom. And we've been very strong advocates of national security as a media organization. There's some people that was in vogue in the media for a while that if you're a journalist, you're really not an American, you're a citizen of the world. And there was the famous story where they would ask journalists if there was some information you had that could protect American soldiers but would show that you were not an objective journalist. And they would ask this at certain journalism schools. A lot of journalists would say, we'd rather see the Americans die. And actually, there's some people that subscribe to that. I believe I'm first an American, a journalist second. When we started Newsmax, I saw ourselves as an heir to the legacy of people like Bill Casey and Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. I might add that we have a very close associate of Mrs. Thatcher with us tonight. He's a guest of mine. His name is John Brown. John was a member of Parliament, was probably the closest member in Parliament to Mrs. Thatcher. After graduating from Sandhurst, he went on to be chief of the pallbearers at Winston Churchill's funeral, was in the Queen's Guard, and John was one of the strongest coal warriors during that period. In fact, when Gorbachev came over to England and they weren't sure, as Agriculture Secretary, if they could trust him, it was John that was assigned by Mrs. Thatcher to meet with him and vet him. And John is continuing that fight, and I'm very glad he's with us tonight. John? Also at my table, I might add that we have a freedom fighter from Hungary. You may have seen him on CNBC talking about financial news. He's here with his partner, Lynn Sweet. His name is Thomas Petterfy. And Tomas is the owner of Interactive Brokers, came over not wealthy, as a refugee, essentially, an immigrant from a communist country, and not only built up a tremendously successful business, it's the #1 digital broker in the country, Interactive Brokers. And he became immensely successful, but he has dedicated a large portion of his activities to fighting socialism. And in the 2012 election and the 2016 election, he personally spent millions of dollars taking out ads warning Americans about the leftward movement towards socialism. And at the time, people said, well, what's this talk about socialism? And now the kids today are supporting a socialist named Bernie Sanders, and half the Democratic field openly subscribes to socialist candidates. So Tomas turned out to be a true prophet and is continuing to warn people about this threat, and we appreciate him joining us tonight as well with Lynn. You know, Mark Twain famously said there were three things unmistakably American. One was the freedom of speech, second was the freedom of conscience, and the third was the good sense never to exercise either. I think at Newsmax we try to break those rules. I know at the center they do. We let people know how we think. I think one of the wonderful things about President Trump and why he's resonated with the American people so much is he'll tell people what he actually thinks. It might not be politically correct. You and I may disagree with it. We might not particularly like the language. But time and time again, he is stating things that needed to be stated and really has shaken up the political system in this country tremendously. And I believe one of the reasons why he is so under attack, I know when Nancy Pelosi pulled the trigger on impeachment, which was rather amazing to me because they had not interviewed any witness. They had not seen the transcript of the call at the time. They had not even supposedly read the whistleblower complaint. And yet she said he committed an offense so serious that they needed to start an impeachment inquiry, which was rather remarkable. Usually you look at the evidence first and then you decide your course of action. But we're living in strange times. And the president called me the next day because I had been on CNN and we chatted about my appearance and some of the things I had said. And he asked me what I thought. And I said, I think you're perfectly fine because you committed no crime and you just did what you were believing that you thought was important for the country to do. I said, still, you have to treat this as a very serious threat. And the reason is, we don't know what the Democrats are up to or what they're planning out of this and what the end game is. And the president is a guy that's extremely confident. I always say that he is a man that can walk on fire and not feel it. And he doesn't necessarily worry about the implications of things. He just does what he thinks is right at the moment. And that has worked for him. And I'm looking now at the situation that we've seen for the past 2 months since this event that was known as the impeachment inquiry. And what we're seeing is there is no there. 2 months into this, there's no evidence of an impeachable crime. So why did we start this inquiry in the first place? And if you look at the polling data, the president's approval data is as strong today, or stronger, than it was before Nancy Pelosi pulled the trigger on impeachment. I think one of the reasons the president is doing so well is he has media like Newsmax, Fox News, other conservative media groups like the Center for Security Policy. I see David's here from Real Clear Politics. We have a number of National Review is represented. Jack Fowler is here as well. We have a lot of important media, and we're all playing an important role. And I think it proves that the pen is mightier than the sword. The pen is mightier than the liberal media spin. They spent 2 years, $50 million, 500 witnesses for a thing called the Russian collusion theory. Remember the headlines? And if you look back, if anybody ever were to really review all the stories, half of them were really fake news. The president was right. They were fake. And now we're faced with this impeachment theory, and I think that we are playing an important role here in defending freedom, and I appreciate the work that Fred and Frank have done, and anything I can do in the future to support their efforts I will do, and I appreciate all of you for your support of this very, very important organization, and I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. I appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you.